Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was known for his paranoia and mistrust of both internal and external political figures. One of the individuals who evoked a significant amount of fear in Stalin was Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister during World War II and the early stages of the Cold War. Despite having been allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, the relationship between Stalin and Churchill was fraught with tension, suspicion, and a mutual dislike that bordered on outright hostility. Churchill's staunch opposition to communism, his strategic mindset, and his ability to rally the Western world against the Soviet Union made him a formidable adversary in Stalin's eyes. Stalin was not only concerned with Churchill's influence on global politics, but also feared that the British leader was conspiring to undermine the Soviet Union and his own power. This fear was exacerbated by the rapidly shifting alliances and power dynamics of the post-World War II era, a wartime alliance of convenience. During World War II, Stalin and Churchill were forced into an alliance of convenience. Their mutual enemy, Nazi Germany, required them to put aside their ideological differences. Churchill, a staunch anti-communist, and Stalin, the leader of a totalitarian communist regime, worked together to defeat Hitler. However, the alliance was never one of true friendship or trust. Stalin's suspicion of the West, particularly of Churchill, was evident even during their wartime cooperation. Churchill, on the other hand, viewed Stalin with a mixture of caution and contempt. He understood the necessity of cooperating with the Soviet Union to achieve victory, but he never fully trusted Stalin's motives or long-term goals. Churchill was acutely aware that after the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union could become a threat to the Western world. His foresight about the coming Cold War shaped much of his dealings with Stalin during and after the war. The Tehran Conference, early signs of conflict. One of the first major post-war conferences where tensions between Stalin and Churchill became apparent was the Tehran Conference in 1943. Although the Allies were united against Hitler, the meeting highlighted deep differences in how the post-war world would be shaped. Churchill was committed to maintaining the British Empire and preserving Western influence in Europe, while Stalin sought to expand Soviet control over Eastern Europe. At Tehran, Stalin displayed his manipulative skills by aligning himself more closely with U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, marginalizing Churchill in the process. Churchill, who had previously been the dominant figure in Allied strategy meetings, found himself sidelined. Stalin exploited Roosevelt's desire to distance himself from British imperialism, knowing that dividing the Western Allies would benefit the Soviet Union. For Stalin, Tehran was a test of Churchill's loyalty to the wartime alliance, and the British leader's increasingly critical stance toward Soviet expansion fueled Stalin's mistrust. From this point on, Stalin viewed Churchill not just as an ally, but as a potential enemy whose vision of post-war Europe clashed sharply with his own. The Yalta Conference strained relations. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 was another pivotal moment in the deteriorating relationship between Stalin and Churchill. By this time, Nazi Germany was on the verge of defeat, and the focus of the conference was on how to manage the post-war order. While Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill came to agreements on several key issues, such as the division of Germany and the formation of the United Nations, tensions over Eastern Europe were palpable. Stalin was determined to establish pro-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, which he viewed as a vital security buffer against future threats from the West. Churchill, in contrast, was deeply concerned about Soviet domination of the region. He argued that the countries of Eastern Europe should be allowed to choose their own governments, free from Soviet interference. Stalin's paranoia was exacerbated by Churchill's insistence on holding free elections in Eastern Europe. The Soviet leader saw this as a direct challenge to his authority and an attempt to weaken Soviet influence. Moreover, Churchill's firm stance against the spread of communism led Stalin to believe that the British Prime Minister was actively working to undermine Soviet power in the region. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the beginning of the Cold War. One of the most significant moments in the post-war deterioration of relations between the Soviet Union and the West came in March 1946, when Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. In this speech, Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, separating the free democracies of the West from the communist-controlled states of Eastern Europe. He warned of the growing influence of the Soviet Union and called for greater unity among Western nations to counter this threat. For Stalin, this speech confirmed his worst fears about Churchill. The British leader was no longer just a wartime ally. He had become the face of a new anti-Soviet alliance. alliance. Stalin viewed Churchill's speech as a declaration of Cold War, a call to arms against the Soviet Union and its influence in Eastern Europe. Churchill's rhetoric, combined with his advocacy for strong Western defense policies, convinced Stalin that the British leader was actively working to contain and isolate the Soviet Union. This fear was compounded by the fact that Churchill had strong ties to the United States and was able to influence American foreign policy. Stalin worried that Churchill's calls for Western unity would lead to a military and economic alliance aimed at weakening Soviet power. Operation Unthinkable, a secret plan for war. Stalin's fear of Churchill was not entirely irrational. In 1945, as the war in Europe was coming to an end, Churchill's government commissioned a secret military plan called Operation Unthinkable. The plan, developed by British military strategists, outlined a potential invasion of the Soviet Union by Western Allied forces. Although the plan was never put into action, it reflected Churchill's deep concern about the growing power of the Soviet Union in Europe. Operation Unthinkable proposed using the combined forces of Britain, the United States, and the remnants of the German army to launch a surprise attack on Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The goal was to push the Red Army out of Poland and restore democratic governments in the region. However, the plan was deemed too risky, as it was likely to lead to a full-scale war with the Soviet Union, and it was quickly shelved. Despite the fact that Operation Unthinkable never moved beyond the planning stage, its very existence heightened Stalin's suspicion of Churchill. For Stalin, the mere suggestion of such a plan was evidence that Churchill was willing to go to war to prevent Soviet expansion in Europe. It also reinforced Stalin's belief that the West, led by Churchill, would not hesitate to take military action against the Soviet Union if given the opportunity. The post-war world, mistrust and fear. After the end of World War II, Stalin's fear of Churchill continued to grow. The British leader was no longer in office, having lost the 1945 general election to Clement Attlee, but his influence on Western policy remained strong. Churchill's speeches and writings during the early years of the Cold War shaped Western attitudes toward the Soviet Union, and his calls for containment of communism resonated with policymakers in both the United States and Europe. Stalin, who had always been suspicious of the West, saw Churchill as a dangerous adversary whose influence extended far beyond the borders of Britain. The Soviet leader believed that Churchill was part of a larger conspiracy to encircle and weaken the Soviet Union, a belief that was reinforced by the creation of NATO in 1949 and the establishment of Western military bases in Europe. Stalin's fear of Churchill was not just about military power, however. Churchill represented an ideological threat to the Soviet Union. As a symbol of Western democracy and capitalism, Churchill embodied everything that Stalin opposed. The Soviet leader was deeply concerned that Churchill's vision of a united democratic Europe would undermine Soviet control in Eastern Europe and threaten the survival of the communist regime. Conclusion: Joseph Stalin's fear of Winston Churchill was rooted in both personal mistrust and geopolitical realities. While the two leaders had been forced into an alliance during World War II, their ideological differences and conflicting visions for the post-war world led to a deep and lasting rift. Stalin saw Churchill as a powerful adversary who was capable of rallying the Western world against the Soviet Union both militarily and ideologically. Churchill's speeches, his strategic thinking, and his influence on Western policy convinced Stalin that the British leader was a direct threat to Soviet power. While Stalin ultimately outlived Churchill's time in office, his fear of the British leader left a lasting mark on Soviet foreign policy and contributed to the deep mistrust that